about anatomy a little bit, because I noticed you on that poll, a lot of you missed the questions that were related to anatomy. So let's take a few moments and just make sure that we remember what each of these traits are and how to identify them. Okay, so let's talk about the features. So these are going to be important not only for, last week and this week, but the whole rest of the semester. So I definitely recommend, even though I don't have a specific concept review packet for you guys, I do recommend that you take notes. Or if you don't want to take notes right now, I recommend that you go back and watch the recording and take some notes, because this will be important for your exam. All right, so the first feature we're going to talk about is the degree of facial prognathism. Sorry, guys, I always try to figure out where to put the bar so you guys can still see the screen. All right, let's put it right here. All right, degree of facial prognathism. So what we want to do for this feature, we're going to turn the skull so we can see it from a lateral view or a view from the side. So we're looking at the profile, essentially. So we're turning the skull, and we want to look at it like this, okay? So we're looking at a lateral view or a view from the side. So we want to see prognathism refers to how far does the jaw and the midface project forward. So we see in this fossil, this is an Australopithecine, we see a relatively high degree. So high degrees are found in the Australopithecines and also, of course, in the apes as well. As we move into genus Homo, especially Homo sapiens, we see a decreasing or a low degree of facial prognathism. So all the way here on the left, we see an Australopithecine. That's the fossil I'm holding right now. So that's a relatively high degree of prognathism. The one in the middle here, that's Homo erectus. So Homo erectus has some prognathism, but not nearly as extreme as the Australopithecines. So here's Homo erectus right here. So we can say that Homo erectus has a moderate degree of prognathism. And then Homo sapiens, by comparison, our faces are very vertical. So we have little to no prognathism. All right, questions about prognathism? Feeling good? Okay. All right, next feature is the degree of post-orbital constriction. So my advice, guys, break these words down. Orbits are what? Orbits are the eye sockets. So post-orbital constriction, that we're looking at how far does it pinch in behind the brow ridge here, okay? So this is the brow ridge, the supraorbital ridge. So post-orbital constriction is how far it pinches in behind the brow, okay? So we see a high or extreme degree of constriction in the Australopithecines because they have a relatively small cranial capacity. Remember, the Australopithecines have a brain size anywhere from 350 to 550 cc's. So that's, about a fifth of the size of modern Homo sapiens. So we tend to see high degrees of post-orbital constriction in species that have a smaller frontal region of the brain. Okay, so higher degrees in afarensis here. And then by the time we get to, mid-genus Homo habilis time, about 1.8 million years ago, so the cranial capacity has now expanded to about 800 to 1100 cc's. So we see that there is still some constriction behind the brow ridge, but it's not nearly as extreme as what we saw in the Australopithecines. And by the time we get to Homo sapiens, we can all try this at home. So start at your brow ridge and feel up to your hairline. We have no constriction. We have the largest brain size of, well, Neanderthals actually have a slightly larger brain than we do, but you guys get the picture. We have a relatively large brain size in comparison, and we have no post-orbital constriction. All right, questions about post-orbital constriction and how to identify it? Feeling good? Okay. All right, next feature that will be important, degree of zygomatic flare. So remember, break those words down. So zygomatic bones, those are the cheekbones. So zygomatic flare, just like it sounds, refers to how far do the cheekbones flare outwards to the side. So best way to look at it, in my opinion, is look at it from the superior view. I mean, obviously you can look at it from the front, but in my opinion, the best way to identify it is look at it from the superior view or a view from above. So you can see right now with this Australopithecine, with afarensis, looking at it from this view, you can see that those zygomatic bones have an extreme degree or a high degree of flare. So it's also this picture here in the middle. So a high degree of flare, we can see those cheekbones really well. Okay, so that means that there's pretty powerful jaw muscles. All right, and then in comparison, Homo erectus is utilizing fire and utilizing tools to process their food and make it easier to chew, and therefore reducing the pressure on the jaw muscles. So by the time we get to Homo erectus, when we look at it from this view, we can kind of see the zygomatic bones are kind of peeking out there, but they're barely there, right? So we have, I'd say, a slight to moderate degree of flare in Homo erectus. And then by the time you get to us, by the time you get to Homo sapiens, we have a very gracile zygomatic bones in comparison. Okay, so that's degree of zygomatic flare. We see high degrees in the Australopithecines, and we see moderate degrees in early and middle members of genus Homo. By the time we get to Homo sapiens, we have very slight degree of flare, very gracile cheekbones in comparison. All right, next questions about zygomatic flare before I move on. Feeling good? Okay. All right, next feature, the shape and robusticity of the supraorbital ridge. So again, I recommend always breaking these words down to make them easier to understand. So orbits are the eye sockets. The word supra means above. So the supraorbital ridge simply refers to the ridge of bone that is directly above the orbits. So supraorbital ridge is basically a fancy way of saying our brow ridge, okay? So the Australopithecines have a pretty robust brow ridge here. Also, even in Homo erectus has a pretty robust double arch brow ridge. So that's indicating powerful muscles in the face for chewing and more in the anterior dentition. So more meat chewing. Also heidelbergensis, which we haven't gotten to yet. We'll talk about heidelbergensis next week, but you see this Homo heidelbergensis fossil here in the middle has a really pronounced double arch brow ridge here, indicating really powerful muscles in the face. And then by the time you get to Homo sapiens, we have a really gracile or delicate brow ridge, okay? So everybody feel your own brow ridge. You may feel a little bit of bumpiness, but it's in comparison a very gracile brow ridge. All right, questions about supraorbital ridge? You guys are good? Okay. All right, next feature. This one's an easy one. Sagittal crest, the bony mohawk. This one's easy to identify, in my opinion. So this one, you know, we've talked about this one before. We talked about it in Unit 2 when we looked at the male gorillas. We saw the bony mohawk feature, but we also see this in the robust Australopithecines. But this is also a really good way to identify, like that question in your poll quiz at the beginning of class, when I asked about, you know, imagine that you find this fossil with a relatively small brain size, an extreme degree of postorbital constriction, an extreme degree of zygomatic flare, a sagittal crest, and massive molars. What species are you looking at? So if you know for sure it's a hominin, it's asking about a hominin fossil, and there's a sagittal crest, and you've only got one robust Australopithecine in your options, and you know that that has to be correct, because at least as far as hominins go, Paranthropus is the only genus that has a sagittal crest. Okay, so this feature, the bony mohawk, is essentially the attachment point for powerful jaw muscles. And we know that because of this craniofacial feature, we know that the robust forms must have had a diet of rough, fibrous food items. So they were predominantly eating vegetation that required a lot of chewing, a lot of stress on the chewing muscles. Okay, so they required a very powerful chewing complex, essentially. And remember, that was likely one of the predominant reasons for their extinction, because they had a very narrow, limited dietary breadth. They were eating too few food items. All right, sagittal keel. So like I mentioned on Monday, the way I remember it, you see the crest, but you have to feel the keel. So the sagittal keel, it's in a similar location as the crest. It's still along the sagittal suture. That's why they call it the sagittal keel, because it's located along the sagittal suture. That's what separates the two parietal bones here. So those of you in lab probably know this, but just to review a little bit, the bone in the front is the frontal bone. The top sides, those are called the parietals, and the bone all the way back is the occipital bone. And then the bone here by our ears, we call that the temporal. But the sagittal suture, that's the suture that separates the two parietals. So the sagittal keel is located along that suture. So I'm sure it's hard to see here in this on Zoom, but you have to feel the keel. So you take the palm of your hand and you run it across the center of the skull, and it's going to feel kind of like a speed bump, okay? So you see the crest, but you have to feel the keel. So this feature is not necessarily related to diet, but rather just thickening of the overall cranial bones. So you can see in these photos here, I scoured the internet and tried to find the best pictures I could for you guys of the sagittal keel. This is my fossil here. And then this is a picture that I found on the internet. You can kind of see the keel running down the center here. And then also from the posterior view of this drawing, you can see the kind of speed bump feature that we call the sagittal keel. So we see the keel in Homo erectus, and we'll also see it in some forms of Heidelbergensis. So we'll talk about next week. All right, occipital bun. We haven't actually gotten to this one yet because this is something that you only really see in the Neanderthals. And sometimes there's a slight one in Heidelbergensis or even a slight one in modern Homo sapiens. But we'll get to this one next week. It's on the occipital bone, and it's this dinner roll shaped protrusion that's found in archaic and some moderns. And the reason, anytime you see a bumpy protrusion on bone, it likely means that there's a muscle or a ligament that attaches there. So the occipital bun, found mainly in Neanderthals, is the attachment point for what we call the nuchal ligament. So that's a ligament in our neck that's really important for keeping our head stabilized and preventing it from pitching back and forth too severely during bipedal walking, running, hunting, things like that. All right, so we'll get into that one more next week. All right, last one, the mandibular symphysis, or also sometimes called the mental protuberance. So this is the chin region. So this will again be important when we talk about modern Homo sapiens next week. But the mandibular symphysis is talking about the region where a chin would be. Modern Homo sapiens, we are the only ones that have a protruding mandibular symphysis. So when you start here at your lower lip and feel down, that protrusion, that's the chin area region there. That's a protruding mandibular symphysis that we only see in Homo sapiens. Every other species that we're going to look at, when you start at the mandibular teeth and feel down, is either going to be receding or vertical, okay? So once we get to the Homo sapiens next week, and that'll be a really easy way to identify that species, because only Homo sapiens have a protruding mandibular symphysis or a true chin. All right, questions? Yes, Amalia.
Would these be available on our module if
Yeah,
they are?
I can put these slides in your module, and I'll post the
That'd be
recording for
great.
this too.
That'd be
Sure,
great. Thank
yeah,
you.
would that be helpful? I'll make sure that I post, when I post this lecture, I'll just put the PowerPoint slides right in there for you. Good question. Other questions? Okay, so that was just a quick review on anatomy, and this is important, guys, because this is something that, it's going to keep popping up, especially if you end up taking the lab. It's important that you understand how to identify these features, you understand what they mean. It's going to be important for both lecture and lab. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Homo naledi. So Homo naledi was a surprise, huge surprise to paleoanthropologists. And I'll tell you guys why here in just a moment. And we're going to watch some clips on naledi. So Homo naledi was discovered in the Denali chamber, also called the Rising Star Chamber. These fossil remains were actually discovered by cavers. They were doing some caving and they came across these fossils in South Africa. And these cavers knew Professor Lee Berger, Dr. Lee Berger, and they alerted him to this particular fossil find. They're going to go into the entire story in the Dawn of Humanity film that you guys are watching this week for your required discussion. So you will get the whole story, and they'll probably tell it a lot better than I'm telling it. But basically, it was the original site was uncovered by cavers. And once Lee Berger was alerted to it, of course, he was interested and he went to go check it out. But the cave is so difficult to get to that he could not go in the cave himself. So he had to recruit very small, petite paleoanthropologists that could go down in the cave for him. So it was a huge expedition. They had to have a lot of technology, a lot of cameras, a lot of safety procedures, because there's portions of the cave that are extremely difficult to squeeze through. And it's dangerous, of course, because if something shifts, then they could be trapped in that cave and unable to get out. So very dangerous, very involved expedition. And they go into the details of this in the Dawn of Humanity film. But another big surprise was, so we have this relatively small brain hominin with a relatively mosaic postcranial anatomy. So Homo naledi was likely a habitual biped, not an obligate one, because she had features like shoulders that are adapted for arboreal climbing. She had a very mosaic pelvis, so just meaning that part of the pelvis looks more like a biped, top half looks like a biped, bottom half looks like a quadruped. Long curved finger bones, again, indicating some degree of arboreal tree climbing. But also some other features that indicate genus Homo. So features like a larger double arch brow ridge, which is similar to what we see in Homo erectus, smaller teeth and mandibles, which is a genus Homo feature, and also really slight degree of postorbital constriction. So when the Berger and his team first uncovered these fossils, and I'm going to show you a little clip here in a moment, it was really shocking because they had to debate whether it was an Australopithecine or genus Homo. And once they uncovered the crania, they really felt it was genus Homo because of the really slight degree of both zygomatic flare and slight degree of postorbital constriction. They really felt that the cranial features indicated genus Homo, but the postcranial features from the neck down really were more like an Australopithecine. The other shocking thing was the evidence that this particular cave site was an intentional burial site. So the reason they think this is because at this particular cave site, they only find remains of the very young and the very old, which is typical of a cemetery population. Even if you look at cemeteries of modern day humans, it's really common to find a higher incidence of the very young and the very old. The other reason they feel that it's an intentional burial is because only hominin, essentially only human bones, were found. There was a few bones from an owl that were found, but really the vast majority of skeletal material in this cave belonged to hominins, belonged to Homo naledi. So it doesn't look like this is a site where carnivores were dragging these hominins into. It doesn't look like that. It looks like this might be an intentional burial site. The other big surprise that was actually just announced less than 6 months ago is they now have evidence that they were using fire in this cave as well. So they were possibly inhabiting this cave and then also burying their dead there. And this is surprising because we have this relatively small-brained hominin that's behaving in very complex ways. So before the discovery of Homo naledi, it was really thought that the earliest examples of symbolic burials and symbolism didn't come along until at least the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals existed between about 200,000 to as recently as 30,000 years ago. Okay, so this was a huge, huge fossil find. Because before they were able to date the site, I mean, we see we've got this date up here, but before they were able to date the site based upon these features, everyone thought this has to be an early member of genus Homo. Because we have all of these features that are Australopithecus-like, we have a small brain size, we have a rounded globular cranial shape, we have a slight degree of constriction, we have a slight degree of zygomatic flare. All of it screamed early member of genus Homo. Okay, so that was really what everybody thought. But once they were able to effectively date the cave site, they were radiometrically dating it, the date range was surprising as well. The date range is 335,000 to as recently as 226,000 years before present. So that was a surprise because early genus Homo was around 2.5 million years ago. So everyone fully suspected that Homo naledi was around during the same time as Homo habilis, maybe into Homo erectus time a little bit, but everyone was really shocked of how recent their date was. Now, it's certainly very, very possible that Homo naledi originated around the time of Homo habilis, 2.5 million years ago, and they just simply survived this long, especially if they were behaving in very complex ways, if they were symbolically burying their dead, if they were controlling fire, if they were consuming high quality protein diets, if they were capable of persistence hunting, possibly. We just don't know yet. This is such a new find that we don't know yet. And this is one of the reasons why I love this field, because we haven't completely uncovered all of the evidence yet. We are still in the process of, just paleoanthropologists are still out there finding new fossils all the time. So that's one of the many reasons I find this field exciting, because we haven't answered all the questions yet. So I'm going to show you guys a couple little clips. I don't want to give too much away because I do actually really, really want you guys to watch the last hour of this documentary before you do your discussion this week, because it's a really good documentary. It's a really recent one. It's really well done. When I watched it, it really helped solidify a lot of my understanding of how human evolution works. So I really do, there's not many films that I make you watch the whole thing of, but I really do encourage you to set aside an hour sometime before Friday so you can watch this film. But I am going to show you guys a couple clips just because it's important to understanding what I mean when I say, there was a debate essentially whether Homo naledi should be an Australopithecine or genus Homo. So I'm going to show you a couple clips that help them determine that. And I'm going to show you the clip too when they talk about why they feel it's an intentional burial, because that's an important aspect of this discovery. Do you guys have any questions before I show the video clips? Let me just make sure I remembered to optimize for sound here. Okay. Oh, and let me make sure I turned the sound up. Yes, I did.
But the most tantalizing question of all is still unanswered. How did these primitive creatures evolve into more advanced human ancestors? To find out, scientists need to find perhaps the most elusive fossils of all, the first members of our genus Homo. For decades, the only fossils that came close were the fragmentary remains of a creature called Homo habilis, handyman.
In the early 1960s, fossils discovered from Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania by the Leakeys led to the definition of a new fossil species in our evolutionary tree, Homo habilis, handyman. And what was significant about that is that stone tools were connected with what Leakey proposed as the first human, a member of our lineage, the genus Homo.
Like most scientists at the time, Louis Leakey thought our evolution was probably a gradual linear process, a single chain of species becoming progressively more human. He decided the key event that made our ancestors cross the threshold to humanity was not the invention of weapons, as Raymond Dart believed, but tools. Since Homo habilis seemed to be the first tool maker, he declared it the first member of our genus, Homo. Here at last was the link between the ape world of the Australopiths and the human world of Homo erectus.
So there was always this gap between Australopithecus and later members of the genus Homo, like Homo erectus and Neanderthals, and we didn't really know what species in that gap would have looked like. And then along in the 1960s, along comes Homo habilis, and it's slightly bigger brained, it's probably a bit more bipedal, and of course it had these stone tools associated with it. And it was argued very strongly to be a contender for early Homo, and it was instantly controversial, and it's still controversial to some people today. It's a bit of a mess.
Because it became clear, probably in the 1990s and moving into the early 21st century, that Homo habilis, we really didn't know what that was.
One of the main reasons for classifying it as human was that it was found with tools. But that is now looking less like a defining characteristic of the genus Homo. We now know that even the more primitive Australopiths had the capacity to use stone tools. Zariah Lemziged, who discovered a 3 million-year-old Australopith called Dakika Child, has found what he believes to be evidence of stone tool use in the same period.
If you were defining Homo habilis as a tool maker, tool user, then what do you make of it when you see that Australopithecus was doing the same thing.
We know that there is rudimentary stone tool use, not stone tool, but stone use among living chimpanzees.
All right, so that one kind of gave you a little bit of a history of the, kind of a gap that we have when we're looking at that transition from the Australopithecines into early members of genus Homo. So, that's another reason why when Homo naledi was first discovered, we, paleoanthropologists in the field really thought, oh, this may be the earliest member of genus Homo instead of Homo habilis. But of course, the date has kind of thrown that off just a little bit. This next one, okay, this one here is going to talk about, essentially once they pull the crania out of the rising star chamber, how they determine that it's indisputably a member of our genus.
Large orbital ridges with indentations behind them would indicate Australopith. Smaller brow ridges with evidence of a more rounded skull would say Homo.
We do have our genus.
We do.
We have our genus with that. This is indisputably Homo.
The team's verdict is clear. They have a new member of our genus.
Did we do good?
We did good.
Oh, yeah.
Now the question is, what can it tell them about the mysterious dawn of humanity?
We are certain that this is in the genus Homo, our genus, and we are certain it's a new species. And that's where we are right now. The idea that we've discovered a large number of individuals, males and females, young and old, of a new species in the genus Homo.
In the next phase, they'll have to piece together and analyze the rest of the fossil remains. Already they have almost 2,000 bone fragments from more than 12 individuals.
The rising star discovery is one of the most startling and amazing discoveries in all of hominid evolution. To have that many fossils in one place is unprecedented and took everybody by surprise.
The excavation was planned as a 3-week operation. As it nears its end, the scientists know they will have barely scratched the surface of what Rising Star has to offer.
I have never seen or dreamed of anything like the richness of this site. There aren't just hundreds of bones. There are thousands of bones. It's clear. You can't blow on the ground and it doesn't uncover another one. They can't gently brush their hand across it and teeth and long bones don't fall out, usually of another individual. This is going to take a long, long, long time.
As everybody goes home, the Rising Star fossils are carefully transported to the University of the Witwatersrand. It was here, 90 years ago, that Raymond Dart sparked a firestorm by declaring that the dawn of humanity was in Africa. It seems fitting that it is here, too, that the mysterious early humans of Rising Star will begin to tell their story. At a symposium 6 months after the excavation, researchers meet for an intensive analysis of the fossil material.
They're in the analytical phase here. They're in the diagnostic phase. And it's been an experiment in, working together with bringing together some of the brightest minds on the planet with some of the most current data sets to analyze over 1,700 fossil hominin remains that we recovered only last November. And it's been fantastic to watch. I mean, it's this constant energy of science, and you can almost feel it.
All right, so even since this has come out, they have, as they continue to excavate this site and find more and more fossils and find more and more evidence, they've come out with some pretty exciting announcements. There's an extra credit opportunity this week. If you want to watch one of Lee Berger's lectures, he talks about the evidence that they controlled fire. The last one I want to show you guys, because I do want you guys to spend some time with this video on your own, but the last little clip I want to show you is evidence that Homo naledi was intentionally and possibly symbolically burying their dead. And it tells you essentially why this is a big deal and the evidence that led Lee Berger and his colleagues to feel that this might be evidence of intentional burial.
Distance is perfect, and I can see marker 2. Record. Recording.
In the meantime, another extraordinary fact is becoming evident. There are no other animals in the cave. All the fossils are human ancestors. This is unheard of.
It was pretty surprising that something completely normal to every other excavation I've ever been in on the continent of Africa, everyone I've ever heard of on the continent of Africa, wasn't happening here. We weren't getting anything else other than hominins.
When early hominins are discovered in caves, they're always found along with the bones of other animals that have either wandered in and died or been dragged there by predators.
They're mixed with antelopes, generally in huge abundance. Then you get, depending on the circumstance, some carnivores and other bits and pieces and rodents and the stuff that accumulates when things die and are eaten and are dragged into caves.
Apart from the bones of a solitary owl, there's not a single other animal in the Rising Star chamber, only hominins. So how did these creatures get in there? The chamber is very inaccessible, deep in the dark zone of the cave, with no entrance other than the long, narrow chute. The team believes it likely was just as inaccessible 2 million years ago. It's starting to look as if the bodies might have been intentionally placed there. Could this possibly be some sort of burial? There has never been evidence of anything like this linked to such a primitive-looking ancestor.
So we got that looming in front of us and don't have an answer to it.
Until now, the earliest known burials are from about 100,000 years ago and a much more advanced form of early human. The team doesn't have a date yet for the fossils of Rising Star, but it seems unthinkable that such a primitive-looking creature could be disposing of its dead. But that's what it looks like. And the age ranges of the individuals are very similar to what archaeologists find in cemeteries.
At the early stages of this expedition, they look like a symmetry population. Very young individuals and very old individuals, and nothing in the middle so far. Doesn't mean we're not going to find middles, but that's what you see in a cemetery when you dig it up. Right now, it looks a lot like that. Will it hold out to be that? That will be a mystery I want to see solved. And we're left with this conundrum of, is what we're looking at, you almost don't want to say it out loud.
All right, so without giving too much away, I do want you guys in your discussion groups today. I know most of you probably have not had the opportunity to watch the whole documentary yet, and that's okay. I just want you to kind of discuss, obviously finish the questions that we started on Monday first. But then